I sat at the head of the long oak table in the boardroom I had built with my own two hands, looking at the people who used to call me Dad and now looked at me like an obstacle. The room was silent except for the hum of the ceiling vents. My daughter-in-law, Vanessa, leaned forward and dropped a thick folder onto the table so hard the water glasses trembled. "Now that Margaret's gone," she said, her voice smooth as oil, "you're going to sign the dealership over to Tyler, and you're going to let the rest of us take care of you, Frank. It's over." I looked at my son Bradley sitting beside her. He stared at his own hands. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I simply smiled, folded my hands together, and waited. Exactly 4 seconds later, the boardroom door opened, and my attorney, Harold Weiss, walked in without a word and set a sealed envelope down directly in front of Vanessa. Before I tell you what was inside that envelope and how I took back everything they thought they'd already stolen, let me know, neighbor, where you're watching from tonight. And if you've ever had to teach a family member the hard way that grief doesn't make a man weak, hit that like button for me. To understand how we got to that boardroom, you have to go back 6 days. The house still smelled like the flowers from the funeral. Margaret had been my wife for 42 years, and pancreatic cancer had taken her from me in 11 weeks. 11 weeks. Neighbor. That's how fast it happens sometimes. One day she's laughing at something on the television, and the next you're standing at a graveside in a suit you bought for weddings, not burials. The house was too quiet after that. I found myself standing at the kitchen sink most mornings, just running the water over my hands, not really washing anything, just needing something to do with them. Margaret used to stand right there beside me every morning with her coffee, telling me about her garden club or some article she'd read. Now there was just the drip of the faucet and the sound of my own breathing. That was the morning I heard heels on the hardwood, quick and sharp, coming down the hallway like a countdown. Vanessa walked into my kitchen in a black blazer that looked more suited for a courtroom than a house of mourning. There wasn't a tear on her face, not one. She set a manila folder on my counter, right next to the coffee mug Margaret had given me for our 40th anniversary, and the sound of it hitting the granite was loud and deliberate, like she wanted me to feel small. I looked down. Across the top of the page, in bold black letters, it read, "Emergency Transition of Ownership, Weiss Motors Group." I looked up at her. "What is this, Vanessa?" I asked, keeping my voice level. She sighed, the kind of sigh you give a child who won't eat his vegetables. "It's for your own good, Frank," she said. "You're 68 years old. You just buried your wife. You are in no condition to run 3 car dealerships right now. We need you to sign this today so we can transfer operational control to Tyler." Tyler was my grandson, 19 years old, a boy who had failed out of 2 semesters of community college and spent more time posting videos of himself doing burnouts in the parking lot of my own dealership than he ever spent looking at an inventory sheet. I looked down at that document and felt something cold settle into my stomach, the kind of cold that has nothing to do with the weather. Weiss Motors Group wasn't just a business to me. It was 40 years of my life. Margaret and I started it with one used car lot in 1984, a lot the size of a gas station, with a hand-painted sign and a coffee can for a cash register. We slept some nights in the back office because we couldn't afford to run the heat at home and the lot both. Margaret did the books by lamplight, while I learned everything there was to know about engines from a mechanic named Otis, who taught me for free because he liked that I showed up on time. Now, 6 days after I buried the woman who built all of that beside me, my daughter-in-law wanted me to hand the keys to a teenager so she could run it from the shadows. I did not raise my voice. In business, the man who loses his temper loses the negotiation. That was something Margaret taught me, actually, more than any business school ever could have. "The business is running fine, Vanessa," I said. "I am grieving. I am not incapable." Right on cue, my son Bradley walked in. 40 years old and standing next to his wife, he looked like a boy waiting to be told he could leave the principal's office. He put a hand on my shoulder, the same gentle, rehearsed gesture I'd seen him practice on customers 100 times when he worked the sales floor for me. He was wearing a watch I had bought him for his 40th birthday. "Dad, please, just hear her out," he said, his voice trembling in a way that felt more performed than real. "Your blood pressure's been high since Mom got sick. We're worried about you. Just sign. Let Tyler hold the title in the family trust, and Vanessa and I will run day-to-day operations. You can finally rest." It sounded so caring. It was the perfect, plausible lie. a devoted son and a concerned daughter-in-law, stepping up to lighten an old man's burden. But I knew my son. I had paid for his business degree at a university he barely graduated from, and I had watched him grow into a man who could not order lunch without checking with his wife first. I looked at the gold pen Vanessa had placed on the counter beside the folder, positioned just so, like a prop in a play. "I'll think about it," I said quietly, stepping back. "I need time to read the fine print before I sign anything that touches what your mother and I built." Bradley nodded, relieved I hadn't said no outright. "Take your time, Dad," he said, forcing a smile. "Just don't wait too long." The market's shifting. They left together, their footsteps fading down the hallway, and I stood alone with that folder and the cold coffee in Margaret's mug. I turned toward the bay window that looked out over the driveway. The glass had gone dark with the evening outside, turning it into a mirror. In that reflection, I watched Vanessa stop by her car, pull out her phone, and start typing fast, her thumbs flying. She had no idea I could see her. She hit send, and as she did, she muttered something under her breath with a small, satisfied smile on her face. I couldn't hear the words exactly, but I read her lips well enough in that reflection. He's softening up. "Get the paperwork ready." I stood there a long time after her taillights disappeared down the street, the water still dripping behind me. They thought I was a broken old widower who'd just roll over. A man loses his mate, neighbor, but he doesn't lose his instincts. Not the ones that built something out of nothing. And mine were telling me loud and clear that something underneath all of this did not add up. The next morning I woke before the sun and drove to the flagship dealership before any of the staff arrived, the way I had for 40 years. I sat in my office with a cup of black coffee and pulled the financial reports myself, something I hadn't done personally in almost 2 years because I'd trusted Bradley to handle the books alongside our accountant. What I found made my hands go still on the keyboard. There were payments, small and spread out over 18 months, going out to a consulting firm I had never heard of, Cornerstone Fleet Advisory. Nearly $600,000 over that period, broken into amounts just small enough that no single payment would ever trigger a board review. I called our longtime bookkeeper, Rosalind, who had worked for Margaret and me since 1991, a woman as sharp as a tack and twice as loyal. She looked into it quietly, without telling anyone, and came back to me 2 days later, white as a sheet. "Frank," she said, "Cornerstone Fleet Advisory doesn't exist. There's no business license, no employees, no office. It's a shell." I sat with that for a long moment. Someone inside my own company was bleeding it dry, one careful payment at a time, and Vanessa wanted my signature before anyone noticed. 3 days after the folder appeared on my counter, my grandson Tyler crashed his car on Route 9, late at night, coming home from a party he wasn't supposed to be at. I got the call at 11:40 p.m. and drove to Mercy General faster than I've driven anywhere in my life, my hands shaking on the wheel in a way they hadn't shaken since the night Margaret's doctor called with her diagnosis. Bradley and Vanessa were already in the waiting room when I arrived, and for the first time since Margaret died, I saw real fear on my son's face, fear that wasn't rehearsed. A doctor came out about 20 minutes later, his scrubs still marked from the trauma bay. "He's stable," the doctor said, and I watched Bradley exhale like he'd been holding his breath for an hour. "But he lost a significant amount of blood, and we need to transfuse him immediately. There's a complication, though." The doctor looked between the three of us. "Tyler's blood type is AB negative. It's rare, and we're low in our own bank tonight because of a highway accident earlier this week that used up most of our reserve. We need a direct family match, if at all possible, so we can move faster. Are either of you able to donate?" The world went very quiet around me, neighbor. The beeping of the monitors down the hall seemed to fade to nothing. "I am O positive." Margaret was O positive. Our son Bradley, I remembered clearly from a childhood tonsillectomy that had frightened us half to death, was also O positive, same as his mother and me. 2 O positive parents can only ever produce an O positive child. That is not opinion. That is biology. The same biology I'd sat through with Margaret in 100 hushed hospital hallways over the years. An AB negative child cannot come from 2 O positive parents. It is not rare. It is not unlikely. It is impossible. My mind, trained by 4 decades of reading balance sheets and catching the one number that doesn't belong, locked onto that fact and would not let go. Bradley could not be Tyler's biological father. There was no version of genetics where that math worked. And if Bradley wasn't his father, someone else was. I did not say a word in that waiting room. I let them draw whatever blood they could from Bradley, useless as it would turn out to be. And I sat in a hard plastic chair with my hands folded, the same posture I would use later in that boardroom, and I thought about every piece I hadn't wanted to look at directly. Vanessa had married Bradley 19 years ago, 6 months before Tyler was born, in a rushed little courthouse ceremony that Margaret always found strange but never said much about, because that's what a good mother does. She keeps her doubts to herself for the sake of peace. Vanessa had grown close, unusually close, with our former general manager, a smooth-talking man named Curtis Boyle, who left the company 9 years ago under circumstances nobody ever explained clearly to me. Curtis Boyle, who understood our books, our accounts, and our vendor relationships better than almost anyone. Curtis Boyle, who I hadn't thought about in years until that moment in the waiting room, when the pieces started sliding into place with a horrible, quiet click. Tyler pulled through that night. He was going to be fine physically. But I drove home near dawn and sat in my truck in the driveway for a long while before I could bring myself to go inside, because I already knew what I had to do next, and I knew it would break something that could never fully be repaired. I called Harold Weiss, my attorney and oldest friend, a man who'd handled my contracts since the lot was still just gravel and a dream. I told him everything: the shell company, the blood type, Curtis Boyle's name, which I hadn't spoken aloud in 9 years. Harold went quiet on the phone for a moment, and then he said what he always said in a crisis. "Frank, let's find out exactly what we're dealing with before anybody does anything they can't take back." It took 11 days. 11 days of me sitting across the dinner table from Bradley and Vanessa, nodding along as Vanessa pushed that folder toward me again and again, telling her I needed just a little more time, watching my son avoid my eyes the way he always had when he knew, somewhere underneath, that something wasn't right, but chose comfort over confrontation. Harold's private investigator confirmed that Curtis Boyle had been receiving payments from Cornerstone Fleet Advisory, the very same shell company draining my dealership, for the past year and a half. Boyle had set up the consulting firm himself, using a cousin's name on the paperwork, and a quiet, careful paternity test, run through a private lab Harold trusted completely, using a sample I discreetly obtained from a coffee cup Tyler left in my truck after a fishing trip, came back with a number I will remember until the day I die. Probability of paternity between subject and Bradley Weiss: 0%. I sat alone in my truck outside the lab with that report in my hands for a long time. I want to tell you honestly, neighbor, that my first feeling wasn't anger. It was grief. A fresh, sharp grief, on top of the grief I was already carrying for Margaret. I mourned the idea of a grandson who wasn't, biologically, mine, even though I knew in my heart that didn't change how I felt about the boy himself. He didn't choose any of this. He was born into a lie 2 other adults built around him, the same as I had been living inside a lie for 19 years without knowing it. I thanked God, quietly, that Margaret never had to find out. That grief lasted about a minute. Then something colder and clearer took its place. The same clarity I used to feel walking into a negotiation I already knew I was going to win. If Bradley wasn't Tyler's father, and Curtis Boyle had spent a year and a half draining my company through a fake consulting firm, the math wasn't hard to finish. Vanessa hadn't just betrayed her marriage 19 years ago. She and Curtis had built something patient and ugly on top of that betrayal, and Margaret's death was the opening they'd been waiting for. I called a full ownership meeting for the following Thursday, the same kind of meeting Margaret and I used to run every quarter, back when this was still a 2-person operation and a shared dream. I told Bradley and Vanessa it was time to discuss the transition paperwork, and I watched Vanessa's eyes light up with something close to triumph. She thought she'd won. She spent that week practically glowing, ordering new furniture for what she assumed would soon be Tyler's office, not knowing Tyler himself had no idea any of this was happening, that he was, in his own way, as much a pawn in her plans as I had almost been. Which brings us back to that boardroom, neighbor, and the envelope Harold set down in front of Vanessa without a word. She looked at it like it might bite her. "What's this, Frank?" she asked, trying to sound bored, but her voice had a crack in it she couldn't quite smooth over. "Open it," I said. My voice was calm. "I want you to understand that, because I know it's hard to imagine staying calm in a moment like that, but I had spent 40 years learning that calm is the loudest thing in any room." Vanessa opened the envelope with fingers that weren't as steady as she wanted them to be. Inside was the paternity report, and beneath it, copies of 18 months of payments from Cornerstone Fleet Advisory to an account registered under Curtis Boyle's cousin's name, and beneath that, bank records showing the exact same account, wiring smaller amounts every month into a personal account Vanessa had opened 4 years ago, under her maiden name. The color left her face the way water leaves a drain, all at once and completely. Bradley grabbed the papers from her hands and read them himself, his mouth opening and closing without sound. 19 years. Vanessa, I said, still calm, still folded hands. 19 years I called that boy my grandson. 19 years I loved him like he came from my own blood, because to me, he did, whether the biology agreed with me or not. And this whole time, you were stealing from the company that put a roof over his head, working with a man who left this family in shame 9 years ago, and you thought grief would make me too weak to notice. Bradley looked at his wife like he was seeing her for the first time in 19 years, which, in a way, he was. Did you know? He asked her, his voice breaking. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. I want to tell you the rest happened fast, but it didn't. Not really. There were lawyers after that, and quiet conversations, and a separation that Bradley initiated himself within the month. Because whatever else my son is, he is not a man who can stay somewhere he's been that deeply lied to. Curtis Boyle was charged with embezzlement and fraud, and the shell company came apart under investigation like wet paper. Vanessa lost far more than the dealership she'd hoped to control. She lost the marriage, the house, and every bit of the life she'd built on top of a secret she thought would stay buried with Margaret. But here's the part I want you to hear most clearly, neighbor, because it's the part that matters. Tyler is still my grandson. Blood test or no blood test, that boy has spent 19 years calling me grandpa, sitting in the passenger seat of my truck while I taught him how to check oil and change a tire, showing up at my door every single Sunday even after the accident, even after everything came out, because he loves me and I love him, and no laboratory report gets a vote in that. I sat him down myself and told him the truth, gently, the way you'd want to be told something like that. I told him none of it was his fault, not one part of it, and that nothing about how I felt for him had changed or ever would. I set up a fund for his education that week, separate from the dealership, separate from any of the family trust fights, just so there'd never be a shadow of doubt in his mind about where he stood with me. He cried. I did too, if I'm being honest with you. As for the dealership, I made changes Margaret would have been proud of. I didn't hand Weiss Motors Group to anyone waiting in line for it. I restructured the ownership so that 30% went into a trust in Margaret's name, funding scholarships for kids from families like the one we started out as, kids who need a coffee can cash register and someone willing to believe in them. Another chunk went to an employee ownership program, because the men and women who showed up every single day for me, who worked the lot in the snow and stayed late during inventory, they were the ones who actually stood beside me when it counted, not the family members circling for a signature. Bradley kept his role, humbled and honest for maybe the first time in his adult life, working his way back to my trust, the slow way, the right way. I stood on the roof of the flagship dealership a few weeks after all of it settled, looking out over the lot Margaret and I built from one gravel patch and a dream, the cars catching the last light of the evening in long, clean rows. Family, I've come to understand, isn't something you can prove in a laboratory, and it isn't something anyone can take from you with a folder full of paperwork either. It's the boy who still calls you every Sunday. It's the woman who kept the books by lamplight because she believed in you before anyone else did. A man loses his mate, neighbor, and for a while it feels like he's lost everything worth holding on to. But he doesn't lose what he built, and he doesn't lose the people who actually choose to stand beside him when the truth finally comes out. I lost my wife that year. I want you to know that plainly, because nothing that came after changes that loss or makes it smaller. But I didn't lose myself, and in the end, neighbor, that turned out to be the only thing that ever really mattered. Blood never guaranteed the boy would stay, and betrayal never fully took him away. What held them together was showing up, Sunday after Sunday, long before any truth came out. Love like that isn't proven in a lab. It's proven in the small, steady choices we make for each other. So call the people you love today, not because you have to, but because you still can. A small note for you. This story was written and fictionalized by AI purely for entertainment, though we hope its gentle life lessons still found a way into your heart.